Hello, and welcome to the Just and Sinner podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper, and thank you so much for joining me once again on the program today. Just a quick reminder that Just and Sinner as an organization is supported by donors, and we really do appreciate the contributions you are able to give us. If you benefited from the things that we do and want to help support us, you can do that by going to justandsinner.org and going to the donate page there. And again, we do really appreciate any support you are able to offer to us. So today I'm doing a live Q&A podcast, and it's been a little while since I've done one of these. I know it's later in the week. I usually release on Mondays. I try regularly to keep up with that schedule, at least on YouTube. Podcast app is not always the same, but I had two conferences in the last couple weeks that I was at, and just it was impossible for me to get anything done beforehand. So I'm here doing this today. So hopefully you all can get some of your questions answered as we discuss. I already have quite a few questions, it looks like. You always can do a super chat if you want as well to kind of prioritize your question. But I will be going through things that I do have in the chat. I received some questions on social media beforehand as well when I had announced this. As always, I'm not going to be able to get to all of your questions, but again, I do appreciate anything that you do ask. So let's jump right into it. Oh, wait, one more thing that I wanted to say because I had a number of people ask about this, and that is the demon possession or demonic possession discussion. I had a number of people asking me about, when I was going to continue that, or if this week was going to be a continuation of that. I'm not sure when the continuation is going to be. It may be a couple more weeks before I'm able to continue that particular series. The reason is just that I have a number of books that I really want to read through, and I have to have the time to do that. And it's been a very busy schedule. I have a number of projects and things that had due dates that were, just recent. So it's been busy enough that I haven't been able to spend the time reading that I would like to for that. And I want to make sure that what I do is adequate. So it just kind of depends on what happens with the schedule in terms of whether or not I'm able to read enough. So I will be getting back to it, but I don't know exactly when that will be. It will be hopefully soon. So hopefully not more than 2, maybe 3 weeks till we continue that. But I do appreciate all the feedback. I know it's a different topic, just like the NDE topic is kind of different from what I usually talk about. So I appreciate that you all seem very interested in a lot of that. All right, so let me just jump into some of the questions that we have as I look into the chat here. One person is thanking me for the works of Rev. Franklin Weidner that we put out and asking if we'll be publishing an updated version of George Henry Gerberding's biography of Weidner. The answer to that is yes. We've been planning on doing that for a while. So Gerberding's little biography, and it's not a long book, it's a short text, is really the only biography of Weidner that's in existence. So nothing else has really been written about him that particularly. But Gerberding knew him. He was a student of his. And so we get an overview of the man and his life and some different details about him. So the plan is to get that published. That will be published as kind of a supplement to our complete works of Rev. Franklin Weidner series. So with regard to that series, we also do have his Christology volume finished. So that is going to be coming out very soon. That it's an excellent volume. Something else that I'm currently working on that we will be doing in the future is and we only have, I think, 2 volumes left in the complete works of Rev. Franklin Weidner series of his dogmatics. We still have other volumes. We have Ethics and his second biblical theology volume and some others as well that we'll be working on too. But in terms of the systematics or dogmatic theology that he was working on, we only have 2 volumes left to release. One of them is coming out very soon. The other one, hopefully pretty soon. I had someone that was working on that and I'm waiting to hear back there. So, once those are all out, we have a plan to put together those volumes and some other writings into what will be a 4-volume hardcover systematic theology. Essentially, we want to complete what Weidner himself started and was never able to finish. And that is something that is like Pieper, that same depth, that same same size basically as being 4 volumes. And in those sections where Weidner was not actually able to finish his writing, what we're doing is supplementing that with writing from others, particularly Charles Krauth, as Krauth was someone who Weidner cites very widely, someone that he learned a lot from. And those who have read Weidner know that a lot of what he's doing is really writing down the things that Krauth taught him that he hadn't written books on. So, to honor him, we have decided to move forward with putting some of Krauth's writing in there to finish out topics of the sacraments and scripture and eschatology, because those are the topics that Weidner did not get a chance to get to before he finished. And there'll be selections of some things in his other writings as well that touch on those topics besides the dogmatic stuff. So I'm really excited about that. That's going to be the first thing we've ever done in hardcover as well. So look forward to that coming in the future as well. But glad you like Weidner. I really appreciate him in so many ways, and he's not he's not a huge name like someone like Walter is, but I think he should be. With that being said, there are some things that I disagree with in Weidner. He was a premillennialist, so that's kind of another question. That is an odd one. Why is this man that is so confessional? So why is he taken by premillennial theology, which is a bit of an anomaly in Lutheranism, but it actually wasn't that much of an anomaly in the 19th century. So that's a discussion for another day. And if you've read his Revelation commentary in the Lutheran Commentary series, as you publish, you'll see that. And I've had a number of people buy that set, and then they look at the Revelation volume and they're like, "What's going on here? This does not seem consistent with the rest of them," and it is odd. But I'm not one to kind of pretend that figures agreed with me when they don't. I want to be fair to his own writing and what he had to say. So, all right. We'll move on then to some of the questions beyond our publishing. We can go on in advertising forever, and I appreciate the questions that allow me to do that. So what about, someone asked me about Anglo-Catholicism, and I really haven't done much on Anglo-Catholicism. I'm trying to think if I've even ever really addressed the question of Anglo-Catholicism. And I don't know that I really have. So let me see what I can say about Anglo-Catholicism, and recognize, I've read Newman, I've read some of the Anglo-Catholics. It's not something that I've spent an extensive amount of time on. I've talked to plenty Anglo-Catholics, but I can't tell you that this is something I've read like extensively on. So my thoughts may be worth nothing, for what it's worth. From what I've seen of Anglo-Catholicism, I know that Anglicanism has a number of different streams or different ways to interpret their tradition. And Lutheranism does too, but not quite as wide of a variety as Anglicanism does. So, Anglo-Catholicism coming from this kind of via media perspective, that there's this middle way between Rome and Protestantism, which a lot of Lutherans relate to that as well. And in some senses, that's true. So Anglicanism grabs onto that, especially with the Anglo-Catholic movement. Anglo-Catholics moving away from an identification of Anglicanism with Reformed theology or Reformed thought. And the thing with Anglo-Catholics is, when I've spoken with people who refer to themselves as Anglo-Catholics, they're kind of all over the place theologically as well. So when you speak to someone who's Anglo-Catholic, they can be largely Protestant in many senses, but more high church in other ways. I have seen, some that believe in transubstantiation, several that pray to saints. It seems like that's a pretty common or standard practice within a lot of Anglo-Catholicism. I've talked to some who seem to accept the authority of the Bishop of Rome, and I don't really understand why they're just not Roman Catholic anyway. And I've heard it said, that Anglo-Catholics are more Catholic than Roman Catholics are in many ways. So I don't know that I am that knowledgeable about all of the ins and outs of Anglo-Catholicism, but I can say just a couple things. The first thing is, almost everyone I know who became Anglo-Catholic just became Roman Catholic. And that's what Newman did, and that's what a lot of people have done. So I think it is very I think it's very difficult to hold on to reject sola scriptura, which is essentially what you really have to do if you're praying to saints. Okay, if you are adopting prayer to the saints, you are giving some kind of authority to tradition that is not consistent with the sola scriptura principle. Because prayer to saints is simply not taught in Scripture, and it's not something that can be found even by good and necessary consequence. There's far more that you have to do to get to that doctrine. So you really can't hold a sola scriptura principle and grab onto prayers to saints. I know people try to do it, but every time I see someone do it, they go to Rome and they go to Orthodoxy, because that's just being consistent. Okay. So Anglo-Catholicism, I feel like in so many ways tends to be just this stepping stone to Rome. It's like you feel a little more comfortable moving there first, and then you go to Rome, or you go to the East. It does. I don't have statistics on this, but this is anecdotal experience. This is just what I've seen. The other is the thing about Anglicanism in general is it is far too loose theologically. This is the reason I'm not an Anglican. I cannot imagine being in a church body where such significant differences exist in doctrine, and we all just kind of are okay anyway and just kind of ignore them. Or I don't get it. I would not be able to do it. So my problem with it is just my broader problem with Anglicanism, which is that there's so much doctrinal looseness that I really have a lot of difficulty with thinking of fellowshipping with people who have such wildly different interpretations of nearly every doctrine. So, and I know that's the appeal in Anglicanism. It's like the big tent thing. And we don't do that as Lutherans. We have a very strictly confessional theology. That doesn't mean there's not room for disagreement. You have more high church Lutherans and you have low church Lutherans. You have differences of opinion in liturgics and different things. I would be on the high church Lutheran side, even though high and low church are Anglican, not Lutheran terms, but they do apply. But when you do get, high church Lutheranism, when you see that, there are much clearer boundaries. So you're not going to see them pushed as far as you see within Anglo-Catholicism. And I see that as a good thing, because inevitably, I think when people go that route, they're probably, if they're consistent, just going to go to Rome anyway. So I know, I'm sure I've angered a number of people there. So sorry to all the Anglo-Catholics that listen. That's what it is. Again, I'm not an expert in this at all. Okay. Let's see. I have thank you, Alex, for the super chat there. Does the filioque imply that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Son ontologically, or is it just a procession in history? Okay, so we're talking about the filioque clause, the notion that in the Nicene Creed, the Spirit proceeds not just from the Father, but from the Father and the Son. This being the key dividing line in some ways theologically between the East and the West. Right, that the East does not speak of the filioque. There is not a belief that the Spirit proceeds from the Son, maybe through the Son, but generally the Spirit proceeds from the Father. The Son is begotten. So the filioque, what does this mean in terms of God's own being, right? God's own relationship within himself. So are we just saying that in the divine economy, that is in history, that Jesus sends the Spirit? No. Okay, so eternal procession is what we're talking about. We're not speaking just about this economy of salvation. But what we are saying is that the economy of salvation, the relations between persons in history, as the Father, Son, and Spirit act within history, is a reflection of an eternal relationship. It's not identical to it. So I think Ronner's wrong in this way. It's not identical to it, but it flows out of it. So they're not disconnected. So in other words, the sending of the Spirit in history through the Son is a reflection, an outflow of what is that ad intra relationship, or that relationship from within the Trinity between the Son and the Spirit. So a lot of modern day Trinitarian theology is a debate surrounding the relationship between the immanent Trinity and the economic Trinity. The immanent Trinity being who God is in himself, and the economic Trinity being who God reveals himself to be in the history of salvation. And Karl Rahner made up what's called Rahner's rule, Roman Catholic theologian, that the economic Trinity is the immanent Trinity. They're the same. They're exactly the same. And we're certainly not going to say they're different persons or something like that. But there is not an exact identification between the way that things work out in history and who God is in himself. So, for example, you see in someone like Karl Barth, you have a kind of actualism. And there's debate about this as well. But where essentially God's eternal being is defined in some way by his act in history. So how God acts in history then affects his eternal being. that's backwards in my view. So when guys like Barth do that, Pannenberg, Jensen, there are some other major Trinitarian figures in the 20th century in particular that argue that route, and they do it by taking Rahner's rule, and I think kind of going farther than Rahner himself did with it. But I think that's mistaken. So when we're seeing the sending of the Spirit in history, I would say that's a reflection of the eternal relationship between the Son and the Spirit. And as I think through this issue of the filioque, it may be worthwhile to actually spend a program dealing with the filioque. It's not something that I've done before, but it's something that I certainly could do. I would recommend reading Anselm's treatise on this particular question, but there's been a lot of writing done as well. The Lutheran scholastics do deal with the filioque and give reasons for it. So maybe we can spend some time talking about those things. But essentially, again, the ontological relationship that is behind what are the acts of the divine economy. So they're not totally divorced from one another. Okay. All right. Let's see. I have a ton of questions here, so where do I even start? Do you think that all Lutheran churches should have an episcopal government? I actually am going to be dealing with this more specifically. I do want to get into some ecclesiological issues. In terms of episcopacy, I'll say this about church structure. From a Lutheran perspective, there is no divine necessity in a particular church structure. So unlike, Presbyterians or Roman Catholics or Anglicans, we would not say that there is one necessitated form of church government. So the question becomes then a little different, because the question isn't what is necessary for the church, but the question is, what do we find most beneficial and what is practically the best thing to do? So we certainly, it is the expectation, very clearly in the early reform, especially if you read like the Apology of the Augsburg Confession, it certainly is the expectation that there are going to be bishops in the church. That's the way the church had functioned. We see since the second century, the church has had bishops in most areas. And pretty early on, it seems like every city had a bishop. Now, as I do delve into some ecclesiological issues, I think we can demonstrate as we look back that there is not an exact identification between how the office of bishop functions then and what Rome later came to see as the office of bishop. There is a long development of that idea and exactly what it means. So what a Lutheran would say is the office of bishop is completely a valid office, and it's a good thing for the church to do, but it's not necessary, right? It's not necessary for the church. So we would say that the office of bishop is not fundamentally a different office than the office of pastor, right? So the divinely ordained office that governs the church is the office of pastor. Now, by human right, there are divisions in that office so that one functions in a different role than another, so that a bishop is a pastor functioning in that particular office as bishop. But there's no difference between, say, the ordination of a pastor and the ordination of a bishop. It's by human right that these distinctions in office have been made. I would argue that it's a good human right. I think there's a reason why the church did it. And I think that the church, in most cases, should probably continue some kind of structure like that. I think when you have just independent congregations, you find so many issues. I don't think that a lot of other ecclesiastical structures have shown themselves to be worthy replacements of what the church had done for the majority of its history. Though I recognize the reasons why different church bodies have chosen to function a bit differently than that. But this also gets to the question of apostolic succession. So if it is the case, which is the Lutheran contention, if it is the case that there is no essential difference ontologically between the presbyterial office or the pastoral or priestly office and the office of the episcopacy, then we don't actually need an apostolic succession that just consists in the laying on of hands from one bishop to another, but all we need is a presbyterial succession to have apostolic succession. So that's a move that happens within Lutheranism. So you'll hear some of the more high church guys talk about a succession, but it's not. We don't see there being a necessity in a succession of bishops per se, because they're simply pastors who have been given this unique role in the church. So there is a book that is it's a 19th century work called "Shall We Have a Bishop," which is written by a Lutheran author. It's very small, and I do want to republish it at some point because I think it's an interesting little work. And I can't even recall the name of the author at the moment. But he gives an argument for the episcopal office and says this is what Lutherans in America should do. Now, I do think sometimes when people from outside of the episcopal system look at the episcopal system, they look at having bishops and apostolic succession of bishops, and there's kind of an idealization of what that looks like. Because in theory, it works very well, right? And in theory, you think about the fact that they have authority, and if they're biblically faithful, they can like get things done. And in practical reality, it too has its own serious defects as well. So what I would say is there are a lot of flaws in really every system, because we're talking about human structures for the church, and it's full of sinful humans. So if you give too much autonomy, people go crazy with the autonomy and don't have accountability. But when you give too much authority to certain people, then those people abuse authority. So the church has a duty to kind of navigate, I think, between complete autonomy of the local church or superiority of the laity and a really strong clericalism that is rooted so strongly, say, just in the episcopal office. So I think a good ecclesiology has to wrestle with going too far in either of those directions. What we saw in Rome in the medieval period and today, when we're looking at the abuse scandals in Rome, a lot of that was covered up because the system is so top heavy. We could see, and not that there weren't good people involved in the top as well, but there's clearly a lot of corruption. And so anytime you have a top heavy organization, it's easier to hide things. It's easier for those people to hide from accountability. And so that's problematic. But it's also, I see, I think if we look at the SBC, for example, and a lot of the abuse issues that have occurred in the SBC that have come out, that I think is largely due to a lack of accountability and a lack of structure that the local pastor can kind of do what he wants. There's no way to hold that pastor accountable because there is no hierarchy. So what we have in American Lutheranism is really kind of a mishmash of all sorts of things. And it does depend on the church body. So I'm in the AALC, the American Association of Lutheran Churches. We are very similar to the LCMS in structure. And we have regions, and we have pastors over those regions to some extent, though we're a lot smaller. So essentially, we really have one presiding pastor that we call him, who is essentially our bishop. I just refer to him as bishop. A number of people do refer to him as bishop. Some people use the term presiding pastor. The LCMS has terms like district president and synodical president. They're bishops. We have bishops. They're just functioning in a little less of a kind of hierarchical way. Not that there is no hierarchy, but they don't have the kind of authority that bishops in some other traditions do. And that's really just a way to try to balance out these things. There's a history in the Missouri Synod with a bishop that came over with the Missouri Synod, Bishop Stephan, and there were immorality issues and all sorts of other problems. And then there were issues with the state church. And so there's kind of a distrust of hierarchy in a lot of ways when Lutherans come to America, and for right reason. Okay, so there is more caution there. But I prefer an Episcopal system to some degree. I think we do have an Episcopal system to some degree. It doesn't mean there can't be improvements. I think it would be an improvement to just use the ecclesiastical term bishop instead of these kind of corporate terms like president. It's just odd and unnecessary. So anyway, that's my hopefully somewhat helpful answer. I don't know. Probably not. I don't know. But that is something that I do want to delve into more. I want to talk about church structures. I do want to talk about the Episcopal ecclesiastical offices, the role of pastor and bishop, how that's worked out historically in Lutheranism, and delve into some of the arguments in different ways. I will say this. The more I read scripture and look at church history, but primarily scripture, the more I am convinced that while I think it is true that the structure of the church is by human right, the more I am convinced that there is still a biblical necessity for accountability and interconnectedness between churches. In other words, what I don't see biblically is an argument that church is simply the local congregation. And if that local congregation desires, it can link up with other churches in some loose way. That to me just does not fit the biblical model at all. So I have a problem with a very loose congregationalism. And with Lutheran pietism, you have a number of people arguing for a very loose congregationalism. I don't see that biblically, and I do want to get into some biblical arguments for that. But just real quick, I will say that when I look at the way that Paul left the church to others like Titus and Timothy, because those are the examples we get in Scripture, and then people that knew the apostles like Ignatius, Polycarp, and others, it does seem very clear that the apostles left particular people in charge in such a way that they had authority beyond just a local pastor. That's why Titus and Timothy are able to judge who's fit to be a pastor, right? They get the list of pastoral qualifications. So the apostles do appoint particular influential individuals to have some kind of role of authority in the church, which is where I would say that the office of bishop essentially just flows out from that. Now, I think it is true in the pastoral epistles. There's not, linguistically, there's no distinction between what is termed bishop and what is termed pastor. So presbyteros and episkopos, they are used interchangeably. Jerome notes this, and many others do as well, that's just how Paul uses the terms. But it's not that divorced from what becomes the distinction between some pastors and others. And it makes sense that when you look at someone like Timothy or Titus, or later, Ignatius or some of these other figures that have a lot of influence in the church, it makes sense that there would eventually come a linguistic way to differentiate between the pastor of the church here and the bishop, or what we see as kind of local pastors in a city, and the one pastor that's the pastor of that city because he's the bishop of that city, overlooking a number of congregations. So I think that is something that simply flows out of it flows out consistently out of the biblical model. Okay, so then Alex, thank you for your comment here. Let's see. The Anglo-Catholics and Puritan-esque should be viewed with caution. They veer too far in one direction. The center is closer to Luther and Calvin. I suppose so. This means with Anglicanism, and I do talk to some people who say Anglicanism is kind of a middle way, really, between Lutheranism and the Reformed Church. That's pretty accurate. I do think that this that probably is historically more accurate. So Henry Esther Jacobs has a book that we haven't reprinted this one, but you can find it on Google Books. I do want to reprint it. We just haven't yet. But Henry Esther Jacobs has a book where he traces some of the Lutheran influence on the development of the Church of England. So within Anglicanism, the Book of Common Prayer is very Luther influenced. Jacobs notes that the Small Catechism was used initially as the first catechism of the Anglican Church. Then it becomes very obvious that the Anglican tradition is in many ways identified with the Reformed. So the Anglican Church is kind of a middle way in many ways, in that it does draw from both of those traditions in different ways. So I can see the argument for that much more. Someone else asked me a question that I saw above related to and I've seen a lot of discussion about this on Twitter recently, for what it's worth. Just the question of, are Lutherans Protestant? And every once in a while, this discussion comes up on social media, and it blows up. And someone says Lutherans aren't even Protestant. We're just the Western Catholic Church purified, which, kind of true. But so I'm not really disputing that. I mean, that is kind of the goal of Lutheranism. But then others come back and are like, well, Lutherans are like the definition of Protestant. You started the whole Protestant thing. What are you talking about? And the argument gets really heated, and you see people going back and forth. So the question was, what do I think about the label Protestant? Are Lutherans Protestant, or are they not Protestant? And a lot of Anglicans say they're not Protestant as well. You see the same discussions there. You see these discussions from Baptists who have some kind of imaginary history, pretending that they go back to the apostles and that there was this persecuted Fundy Baptist KJV only remnant since the beginning, the Trail of Blood stuff, which clearly is just not true. But there's other Baptists that say they're not Protestant because they have some made up history. But So like nobody wants to be Protestant for some reason. I don't know. And then non-denominational churches say like we're just like the Book of Acts. We're not anything, which of course isn't true. But so are Lutherans Protestant? Well, if you have looked at my book series that I'm currently working on, my 8-volume series of it's a kind of a systematic theology, and it's called A Contemporary Protestant Scholastic Theology. So clearly, I'm not opposed to the label Protestant. Now, I'll be honest. To some extent, I know that that's going to be a controversial phrase. Both the phrases Protestant and Scholastic, because a lot of Lutherans don't like to be called either of those things. I even make an argument for Lutheran mysticism in my last book, which is probably more controversial than either of those. But and I recognize that. I kind of doing it on purpose. So yeah, I don't have an issue with the term Protestant. I understand why people do. Because when people say Lutherans aren't Protestant, what they are saying is something that's true. Just like when they say Lutherans are against mysticism, what they're saying is true. But I'm trying to say, let's recapture kind of the historic definition of these terms, because I don't know how helpful it is to define those terms just in ways that just reflect the contemporary use of these words, kind of, but not always. So what Lutherans mean when they say we're not Protestant is what Philip Carey meant in his essay Why Luther Was Not Quite Protestant, which is it's a great article, and I've drawn on it a bit. It's a wonderful piece, and that is that when we talk about, I was always distracting when I'm like trying to read my comments and trying to talk at the same time, and I always end up losing my train of thought. So I need to like hire somebody to just go through the questions. But as you look at what the broader Protestant world is, it's very divorced from Catholicity. Okay, so when you look at what's considered Protestant, it's not sacramental, it's not liturgical, it's totally divorced from the Church Fathers, from the history of the Church. So when people say Lutherans are not Protestant, they're really saying what people think of as Protestant, we're really not that. I agree with that. Okay, so what people in America generally think of as revivalism and the kinds of movements and things that are identified anti-sacramentalism with Protestantism, we're not that. So that's what people mean. But in a historic definition, it has really been the case that Protestant has been kind of the broad term to refer to both to the Reformed and Lutheran traditions. That's the way to refer to what I hear people now say as reformational traditions. So my contention would be that the Lutherans and confessional Reformed are Protestant, and that many of the non-denom people really aren't Protestant. They themselves aren't Protestant. They're the ones misusing the term. There's something else. So that's and that's kind of a separate discussion, I suppose, to get into that in too much depth. So I don't have an issue with the term Protestant. I understand why people are against it, and I sympathize with the reasons. Again, I say the same thing about scholastic, because people identify scholasticism with particular theological convictions coming out of the Middle Ages. And I think that's just the wrong definition of scholasticism, because the same methodology really is at work in the post-Reformation theologians like Gerhard and others. So I have no issue calling them scholastics. And I like referring to Protestant scholastics because it does clearly identify a particular movement in theology that shows a particular group of Protestants and how they kind of react to medieval theology, while also grabbing onto certain elements of medieval theology. So I don't have an issue with the term scholastic. And I said the word mystic as well. And I just to be clear, I think a lot of Lutherans today use the term mysticism for enthusiasm. And again, I would agree with what they're rejecting. But mysticism is a real movement. It's a real movement that Luther himself draws on really extensively, and that Lutheran devotional writers grab onto. A certain strain of mysticism, to be clear, because there's a lot of bad mysticism that is just that, enthusiasm. But Luther can grab onto what is good about that tradition and identify it as good and incorporate it into his theology. So that's what I would say there as well. Okay. Okay, thank you, Alexander here. Let's see, what is your view of contraception, particularly the Roman Catholic approach, peace and blessings? So I actually have a podcast. If you go back into my podcast archives, I have a podcast with a whole discussion laid out of different approaches to birth control. And I've talked about, different methods of contraception, the ethical issues with some and with others that people have. I will tell you this, because I'm not going to give you a strong answer. Sorry. What I do in premarital counseling is, because I always bring this up because I think it's essential that people think through this. Because what I don't think is that should just be taken for granted as, of course, that's right, because that's what people do today without thinking about it. So I always make people think about it. I say, let's talk through the different options and what are the moral and ethical questions that are brought up here. And I want you to think through these. So I will say I'm not convinced enough on this issue in one particular thing to bind people's consciences to that. So what I do is get people to study the issue, think very deeply about it, and make a decision. I will say that I have not been completely convinced that birth control is wrong in every circumstance. Okay, I'm not convinced that every form of birth control is wrong. I will say that when you look historically at the impact of the widespread use of birth control in the 20th century, if as a whole, it's done tremendous damage to society. Like, I think that is kind of inevitable, but it's not just that. That's part of the whole context of the sexual revolution, and there are a bunch of factors there. Societally as a whole, I think what has happened is it has led to sex without consequences, which means sex is totally divorced from procreation. And it's just a fun thing you do with your body with whoever you want, whenever you want. And that is what we have today. And there's no way to be honest and say widespread use of birth control didn't play a significant role in that. So in terms of where we are culturally, that certainly plays a role. But with that being said, I'm not one of these like quiverful guys who thinks that there's a divine, the command to be fruitful and multiply literally identifies a command that is really not just be fruitful and multiply, but have as many children as is humanly possible. I don't see that in the text itself. I will say I do struggle with the idea of a Christian married couple not having kids, in that I think so let me be clear about this as well. It does seem to me the biblical model that it is the expectation that if you're married, you'll have kids. Now, with that being said, there are people who God has not given the ability to have children, and that is 100% fine. And God did that, and that's fine. Okay. So there is that. But I would also say there are exceptional circumstances with health concerns and other things. But in general, I think if you're a couple that just says, I don't want to have kids because I don't want to have to care for someone else, but I really want to get married and I want to travel a lot and we're just going to have dogs and not kids. And I just don't want kids. That I have trouble with squaring with the biblical picture of marriage. So that's where I'm at. If you want to hear more details, that old podcast hopefully will help. Oh, okay. So I see a question here about Eldona. Why do you want me to talk about Eldona? Do you want to get me in trouble talking about these guys here? Oh man, I feel like this at the ALC Pastors Conference I was just at. I feel like everyone asked me about Eldona. I don't know why, but I feel like they kept coming up. If you don't know Eldona, the Evangelical Lutheran Diocese of North America, it's a very small church body, largely breakoffs from the LCMS. How judicious should I be in my answer here? Okay, so on the one hand, I will say this: Repristination Press is a publishing house with Eldona that Bishop Heiser has been involved in. And they put out a lot of great stuff. Very thankful for their work. I recommend them all the time. I'm happy to give them my money because they do good work. And they put out new translations of Gerhard and other things. They're wonderful. I'm very happy to have those resources. But as a church body, um, I I don't really I have significant issues. Okay. I'll say this. If you look at the history of the Missouri Synod in relation to a lot of other Lutheran synods, the Missouri Synod tends to be extremely strict, and I think doctrinal clarity is good. But sometimes the Missouri Synod, when you read some of the just when you read some of the people that were at some of the early Missouri Synod meetings that were kicked out, and it just the behavior I don't think was always great. Like they erred on the side of doctrinal strictness instead of graciousness, and I can understand the reasons for that, but sometimes it wasn't great. Uh, but with that being said, I think that the doctrinal positions of people like Walther and Pieper in some of the debates they had, I think they were correct. And that would be the question of election intuitu fide, and they rejected it, which I also would. I think election unto faith is a much more biblically faithful way of speaking. And also the question of universal objective justification. I affirm that. I've talked about it in a bunch of places. You can find podcasts where I've dealt with that question. What I feel like Eldona has done is, in some ways, they've kind of taken some of the sectarian leanings of old Missouri that I don't think are necessarily good, but they didn't take it with the good parts of old Missouri, which is the good theology. Like they've rejected objective justification and election unto faith. So that leaves me with, I feel like they're a church body that's so formed by Missouri in so many ways, even like in the way they treat others. In not that I've been treated this way by people in Missouri, like not at all, but in kind of I guess the worst situations. But they've rejected a lot of good theology, and I think that what comes across is bitterness toward Missouri and Wells as well. So I don't know. When you listen to some things that Joshua Sullivan's on YouTube, Ask the Pastor guy, and he's got a good beard and everything, but I know a lot of viewers of mine like watch him. They've mentioned it to me, and that's fine. He's probably got some good stuff to say. But I haven't watched a ton of his videos, so I'm not like an expert in what he says. So I don't know, pretend to be, and I'm not talking you away from watching his videos or something. But there have been things that I have seen in some videos that concern me a bit. And for example, there's one video where he discusses lay people doing theology, and it seems like he only thinks that ordained pastors should be involved in theology, and that just is completely incoherent with the reality of our tradition. I mean, Melanchthon wrote more of our confessions than anyone else, and he was never ordained. So there are things that I've seen where there's like really strong strictness on just kind of weird stuff that I just don't get. Anyway, so there are my thoughts. So there's some good things there for sure that they've done, but I'm not Eldona. I have an issue with very tiny church bodies that seem sectarian, that cut off everyone else as if no one is Orthodox other than them. And I get the impression from Eldona guys that I've listened to and talked to that they think they're the only Orthodox church body kind of in the world. I mean, or at least in the United States. And there aren't very many of them. That kind of sectarianism, I'm not a fan of that. So there we go. That's what it is. So some people are, let's see, do I have another? I feel like I had another question. Oh, deacons. Are deacons an ordained office or a lay office? Oh boy. So yeah, and I see someone here says they've learned from both of us. That's great. I'm sure there are great things that he has to say. I'm not saying everything he says is bad by any means. Okay. So in terms of the question of deacons and is it an ordained office or not, that's kind of difficult. And the reason why I say it's kind of difficult is because it does appear that, Stephen is a deacon, but he's also preaching. Gerhard points this out. And in Gerhard's volume in the ministry, he says, well, it seems like his role as a deacon in some ways kind of is that of a pastor. So like maybe the deacon is an ordained office where there is preaching that's acceptable. But then we also have the question of deaconesses, because we do have deaconesses, which is something we recognize in Scripture, and it's an office that we prepare people for. My wife is one. So how do we deal with that? Because we don't, ordain women to preach, and I think that biblically we have reason not to do that. It's a complicated question. So I may leave you with it's a complicated question and say I am going to answer it, but it's something that I've got to spend some more time on and able to really explain some of the different views. I'd love to go through Gerhard and discuss some of the passages that he looks into. But so there are differences among different Lutheran groups as well as to whether deacon is an ordained office or a lay office. So I don't know that I think there's a reason why there's some disagreement there, because I don't know that it is that clear. So anyway, sorry for the non-answer. So someone here is asking about WELS. What WELS Synod is very strict. I do remember you said the ALC only shares pulpit with the LCMS. Your pastor sometimes at your local LCMS church. Okay, so I would say that we, have a great relationship with the Missouri Synod. We do. So right now, and by the way, if you live in upstate New York, where I do somewhere, if you live near Syracuse or Finger Lakes region, I am currently preaching at an LCMS church every week. It's in Auburn, New York, Redeemer Lutheran Church. You're free to join us on Sunday mornings if if you live anywhere near the area, or if you don't and just want to make a drive out. But it's a small congregation, but that's been a wonderful blessing to be able to do that. I was just at the Eastern Region Pastors Conference of the LCMS, and they'd asked me to speak. So I spoke on, at some of my experiences with college ministry and how to reach out to Zoomers and millennials. So it was a fun time. So I've been very much welcomed by the LCMS. We are in fellowship with them. We are, but it's not like we're only in fellowship with the LCMS. I mean, there is a worldwide group of confessional Lutheran churches that are in fellowship with each other. So we have a broad communion beyond ourselves. And I would say that, when you look at that communion that we have, and we've declared fellowship with one another, that we don't actually need to have ecclesiastical unity in order to have unity. So I wouldn't see it as a necessity, for example, that I have to be under the same bishop as the LCMS. So people ask me all the time, why is the AALC not merged with the LCMS? I don't see that as a necessity for fellowship, that I have to have the same bishop, that Bishop Harrison has to be my bishop. Why should that be the case? We've declared fellowship. We're under different jurisdictions, right? So I don't see an issue there at all. So when we say that, our church body is small, we're talking about those who are in this particular church, and that we are under a particular bishop and authority structure there. We're really talking about the worldwide church. This is just a small division of the broader church and the broader confessional Lutheran church. That is, we're all in fellowship with we're in doctrinal agreement. We're doing the same things. Okay. So I think that's really the way we have to look at it, instead of, because the ALC is small. Like, we've got 70 churches, or, I don't have the exact number in my head at the moment, but, okay. Okay. Thank you for that donation there. I see that this. Did the church fathers teach sola fide? If you want to hear my approach to that question, I have done multiple podcasts on it, and I think the first one is on video on YouTube. I did follow-ups that were just audio. It was before I was doing everything on YouTube. So maybe I'll revisit it. It's one of those things that I have thought about is, for a YouTube audience now, maybe I should go back to that topic and re-explore it. Did the church fathers teach sola fide? A lot to say to that question. I would say, to summarize my perspective, every element of the Lutheran doctrine of justification is present in the church fathers. Every element of it is there. What I don't mean by that is that every element of it is there in every church father. So that there is patristic precedent for all of the elements that make up the Lutheran doctrine. But that's not to say that I can just point you to, oh, read this treatise of Ambrose on justification, and he outlines exactly what Luther says. No, that's not true. But that's also just not how doctrinal development works. And I would say the same is true for Rome. They couldn't do that with papal authority either. So what we want to ask is when we develop our language, right? So sola fide is a development of language. By development of doctrine, I don't mean it's a different doctrine. I mean that the church did develop the way it talked about things and the language it uses, and it gets clarity over time. The same thing is true with the Trinity prior to Nicaea, even prior to Chalcedon. There's a bit of confusion about how terms are used, what they mean. The same thing is true in terms of justification. So the question we have to ask is not, did people say justification by faith alone? Which actually, if you just want that, you can find it. You can find it in Aquinas. But you're asking something, you've got to ask, is the substance or essence of what's going on in this teaching, is that something that's just, as McGrath would call it, a theological novum, that just comes out of nowhere? Or is it something that really just grows out of things that the church has always taught? And I would say the latter. So that's the argument that I would make for sola fide. And if you want particular places to go, Clement of Rome, I think that there's certainly evidence of justification by faith apart from works, not just works of the law, but good deeds in general. If you look at the Epistle of Diognetus, you find a clear statement of imputed righteousness of Christ as a covering over our sins, not an infused righteousness. It covers our sins. You find the language of alone in a number of sources. Ambrose is cited in the Augsburg Confession, and he uses it quite a bit. If you want to talk about the role of the law in regards to justification, that the law can't justify because the role of the law is to expose sin and drive us to the gospel. John Chrysostom, read his commentary in Galatians, he's got a number of statements that say that. So and then if you want monergism, Augustine's the guy to go to, of course. So you've got all of the elements there in different places. What I think the Lutheran tradition does is just synthesize it in a way that is clearer than had been synthesized before, but that doesn't mean that it's totally new. Okay, thank you again for this donation here. What is your view of John 6 and the giving, all who come to Christ have faith, or is that about election? Oh, so you're talking about, all that the Father gives to me will come to me. They will be raised on the last day. John 6 is a complicated passage, and it's something that should be dealt with very closely. So how do I summarize this very quickly? If John 6 is just about the elect, there is no, if that's what it's saying, there is no discrepancy with that in Lutheran thought. If John really is saying all that the Father gives will necessarily be risen on the last day, then those whom the Father gives to the Son are the elect. And that's what our confessions say. So, which is how the Calvinists tend to go with that passage. There's no issue there with that interpretation of that passage if it's about the elect. There we would simply say, well, he's dealing with the question of eternal election. He's not dealing with the question of universal grace. Whereas later in John's gospel, when Jesus says, I will draw all men unto myself, there absolutely is universal drawing of all people unto himself. So we have universal grace there as well. There are other ways to read John 6 that try to make the argument that he's not saying of necessity, literally everyone who was drawn will necessarily be raised at the last day. So there are different ways to interpret the passage, but I think whatever way you go with that passage, it isn't inconsistent with the way that we talk about both universal grace and election. But I will say, for the Calvinistic system, John 6 and John 10 are the two strongest passages, without question, in my view. I don't think they prove Calvinism, but I do think that they're the best passages they have. Okay. Right. We don't believe in the negative side of election, meaning reprobation. Right. So that text doesn't talk about that. So, there's no, let's see. There's no, what was I going to say? There's no inconsistency between the Lutheran approach and what's there, because in that text of John 6, there isn't a mention of reprobation. That's not what it talks about. And I know that someone like James White's going to grab onto, well, they were offended by it, and that's why they're offended, because they recognize they don't believe. And I think the offense is really about the Eucharistic portions of the passage, but which I do think is Eucharistic in John 6. And I know that that's a bit of a debated point even within Lutheranism. But I think that really is the offensive teaching that they walked away at. But maybe we should do a walkthrough of John 6, though. It's a great text. It's a beautiful text, and it's one that has a lot of depth to it that we would have to walk through pretty kind of verse by verse to really deal adequately with it. Okay, let's see. Thoughts on the early church's emphasis on man's free will capacity to choose God, such as Irenaeus, Justin Cappadocians, in comparison to Augustinianism. Yeah, and I mean, I know, Ken Wilson and Leighton Flowers and such will go wild with this stuff. But we've all known this. Yes, they do talk a lot about man's free will. And I've talked about this before, and I think you can find a video of mine where I deal with this question, but let me summarize what my answer has been. So the enemies, or the people that the earliest Christians are responding to when they're talking about free will, are fatalists. And so the emphasis on free will is really a response to something that they should rightly respond to. When I'm dealing with a physicalist, materialist, determinist who makes the argument that there is no human soul, there is not even a human self that can make free will decisions, and essentially we just have a bunch of firings in the brain that cause other things, and the notion that we even have a will at all or a consciousness at all is all just one big illusion. I'm going to defend free will when I'm talking to those people. That's not the same question of what is the effect of sin upon the human will in choosing God. That's not the same question. Now, I'm not going to say that those earlier figures didn't also say that we have the free will to choose God, because they do. They do say that. But my point is simply the way we talk about things and the things that we have concern about are going to be shaped by the controversies we face. So it took a Pelagius for the church to work out that question, because that wasn't the question that the earliest fathers were dealing with. So it's just a matter of, and this happens all throughout church history, that when people start asking certain questions that they hadn't asked before, now the church has to rethink things and formulate things in a new way and think more in depth. It's the same thing that happens with Augustine. It's the same thing that happened when Arius started preaching. If you look at someone like Justin Martyr, he's not that clear in the language that he uses regarding the eternal divinity of the Son. It doesn't mean Justin's a heretic. It means that Justin lived in an era before the church had to work out those details because of heretical teaching. It's what all of us do in so many areas. So that's just what happens with Augustine. And the same thing, I would argue, happens when you have this complicated system of merit that certainly didn't exist in the early church in the medieval period. Now you've got to deal with that. And that's where sola fide comes into question. Okay. I see a question about Luther's antinomian disputations. I know I did some work on the antinomian disputations in the podcast, which was quite a long time ago. I mean, that was years ago at this point. Next year is our 10-year anniversary of my having done this. So you can go back, probably 8 years ago, I dealt with the antinomian disputations. But the antinomian disputations were dealing with some claims so earlier in Luther's career, when you see Luther's early writings, he's so clear on the unconditional nature of the gospel. And when you read Luther, he has this expectation that everyone's good, because he's seen this unconditional gospel transform his life, like radically, and those around him, Melanchthon and others. So he's coming with the expectation others are going to see this the same way. It's going to have this radical transformative effect on everyone. And then when you have these visitations to various churches, all of a sudden he realizes that's not happening. like people aren't doing what he thinks they should be doing. So they do all sorts of, they're living in sin. They're really not understanding what justification is about. They don't know the 10 Commandments. This leads to Luther's writing the Large Catechism, which is largely an exposition of the 10 Commandments, and brilliantly so, because people don't know the law. So Luther later in life, and that's not even that late, but we're talking 1520s, but later 1520s. So from that point, Luther is fully aware of the fact that people will misunderstand and abuse what he's saying about unconditional grace. And one of the ways that this happens is that some preachers argue that the law shouldn't be preached in church. Now, they're not saying we don't do the third use of the law thing. They're saying like we don't do law at all, because they say that the law is, and they use Luther's two kingdom distinction to say, well, the law is good, but it's for the outside world. Like it's for the law courts. It's for how you deal with your family members and stuff like that, which it is. This is true. They're right about this. But they say because of that, that's all left-hand kingdom stuff. And that's not what the church is about. The church is just gospel, which means you don't need to preach the law at all. That's just, you deal with that in other places. The church is just gospel. The outside world is law. And Luther is very harsh against this. So the Antinomian Disputations, it's a great work. I would recommend reading it. But in the Antinomian Disputations, Luther counters that. So it's a great work to look at to see what does Luther say about Christian obedience, how necessary is Christian obedience, and what does the preaching of the law look like in the church? Is it necessary for the church? And Luther's the one who coins the term antinomian, which, people call Luther an antinomian all the time, which is funny because he's the guy who coined the term to attack particular people. And I would make the argument that Luther also, beyond just preaching second use kind of stuff, like you preach the law and that you tell people they're sinners, I would say that there also is a bit of encouragement to preach on sanctification, to preach on the holiness of life, how you should live. There's a quote that I know Walther cites in Proper Distinction Between Law and Gospel, where he says there are many Christians who are great Easter preachers but terrible Pentecost preachers. And he goes on to explain what he means by that, which is they preach a beautiful gospel of the death and resurrection of Jesus, but they never talk about the role of the Spirit in new obedience. Luther certainly sees that there's a place for new obedience. And if you read his sermons, that's just clear. I mean, I can point to a bunch of sermons that have a lot of new obedience talk and end on law rather than gospel. So I think a lot of these caricatures are kind of mistaken. But yeah, Antinomian Disputations, it's really helpful. And I would definitely recommend looking at that. Yeah, so I think one comment here, it seems a small catechism's purpose is to use the law to teach Christians how to live the regenerate life. Yeah, absolutely. And the Large Catechism is even more clear, I would say, because Large Catechism gives context to all of that as well. And it's interesting. I dealt with this in my book, Hands of Faith, on the two kinds of righteousness. I talk about what Luther does there in the Large Catechism and how that fits into this. All right. I am just about out of time here. I see someone was asking a bunch of times about, online church, I believe. I would say and I've gotten a lot of questions on this because I did that talk on online communion, and we had some people talking about this. I don't believe that the biblical definition of ecclesia as gathering fits the context of what church is. Of what an online church would be. I don't think that online church is an ecclesia, and that there is, if you look at what church is in the New Testament, it is local gatherings with local people. That's why you have the church of the place where they are gathered physically in person. It seems to me that the necessity of something to be church, and yes, there is, of course, the sense of universal church, absolutely. But if we're talking about a gathering that is church, the two or three being gathered, there really is no room for anything other than a physical gathering, biblically speaking. And, I hear people say, and I get this question, and I understand But I can't get to a good Lutheran church. There's none I can get to. And I, sympathize with that. Like that, I wish you did live near a good Lutheran church. And, you can watch some Lutheran services online and hear some great preaching and see things and get edified by it. But it simply still isn't the biblical definition of what church is. And I can't change that because of your circumstance. So like, I just, in some ways, I don't know what to say, but I would say drive far to get to a church if there is one. Look for a church and see if there's anything you can get to, even if you can't go every week. I mean, I know people that drive 3 hours once a month to go get the Eucharist at a church. And obviously it's not ideal. I wish I could just create a bunch of Lutheran congregations in every town in the world and have a bunch of pastors show up. Like, that'd be great. It's just not the reality of what we have. So, and I also don't want to be like totally insensitive, be like, well, just move to an area where there's a Lutheran church. And part of me wants to say that because I do think that should be a consideration when I move. But like, I don't know your life circumstance. Maybe that's not possible at all. And I don't want to pretend that it is. So I have no idea. But yeah. And I think, contact a Lutheran synod, see if there's anybody that, there's any desire to plant a church in your area. Try to, find maybe a pastor who's actually willing to drive out to you from farther away, because that does happen sometimes as well. Yeah. So sorry about the difficulty of the situation. Like I unfortunately, I don't have a great answer, and I really wish I did. And I understand why people want to say, well, online church is just what you do because there's no other option. But I can't bring myself to say fundamentally that something that is so different from what the biblical definition of a thing is okay just because of necessity. I can't go that far. Sorry. Yeah. A family worship is something that's good to do. I think going through matins, doing a liturgical service, there are still other ways. There are still other ways of like gathering with Christians in person that aren't Lutheran. I mean, I think Christian fellowship is essential, even if you can't fellowship with Lutherans. It's not like you need to cut yourself off totally from everybody else. Yeah. And then someone says Lutherans have stringent rules for ordination. And does that lead to areas lacking churches? I don't know about that. So first of all, if you're talking about strictness of ordination, I think that's a good thing. But in the ALC, we have a program that is an extension program at a distance that people can do while they're working another job. Like which is the American Lutheran Theological Seminary. I'm the president of the seminary. So you can check that out if you want. alts.edu if you have a desire, but we do try to make it possible for people who wouldn't otherwise be able to do seminary financially, or just life circumstances can't move and those kind of things. So there are options. And okay, so having to get only Lutheran seminary degrees. So we have, okay, so if you're Lutheran, the church body will want you to get a Lutheran seminary degree, which is, I think, quite sensible, because we will want you to be trained in doing pastoral ministry in a Lutheran way, because we do it differently. We don't want you coming into the Lutheran church with a Baptist degree and doing Baptist ministry in a Lutheran church, because you're not applying law and gospel in the way that we would. But I will say that I know plenty of people that are pastors in our church body that don't have a Lutheran seminary degree. They've come in from another tradition and have become Lutherans later. We do have a colloquy process that you can come in. We determine kind of where you're at, what you need. There are some maybe seminary courses you'll have to take online to fill in gaps, or we'll kind of try to figure out where you are theologically and practically, where your knowledge is needed. But we're not going to make you redo your entire seminary program. Okay, that's not going to happen. All right. Oh, aren't you putting fellowship above doctrinal precision? So this is where I disagree with Wells. And thanks, Chad. I have some of our seminarians in the chat right now, so you can, they'll tell you about the experience that they've had, and hopefully it's been a positive one, including taking my courses. I teach Doctrine 1 and 2, and I teach Confessions 1 and 2 as well. So when we're talking, and I'm going to end here in a minute, but when we're talking about fellowship, Wells does not make a distinction. So the Wisconsin Synod does not make a distinction between different kinds of fellowship. So they say Eucharistic fellowship, prayer fellowship, it's all the same. We can only have Christian fellowship with people we are in total doctrinal agreement with. That's going to be my biggest disagreement with the Wisconsin Synod. We would make a distinction between Eucharistic fellowship and pretty much any other kind of Christian fellowship. So I spend a lot of time, like, I get together with Reformed friends. I get together with a pastor at a Vineyard church. I get together with people from all different traditions, and we're all Christians. That doesn't mean that we're part of the same church body. We're all going to share the Eucharist together. I do believe one day we will, before the throne of Christ, we'll share in that final meal together. Absolutely. So I would distinguish between kinds of fellowship. And even if you can't have full, what we call altar and pulpit fellowship, so that's what we label it, with another Christian, that doesn't mean that there's no benefit to like having Christian fellowship. I think it's, invaluable. I am extremely thankful for the Christian friends I have that are not Lutherans, and they've been very helpful for me in many ways. I think they're missing things. Without the law gospel distinction in the same way, they're not going to speak in the same categories and things like that. But nonetheless, I still think Christian fellowship is important, even if you have doctrinal disagreements. Eucharistic fellowship is of a different category. That gets into the closed communion issue, which don't have time to get into. Well, thanks for. Let me answer this really quick. Does the LCMS or AALC require a literal 6-day creation belief of their newly ordained pastors and deaconesses? If I can answer that quickly, we have no such statement. You can find all of the statements from the AALC that you have to affirm. You do have to affirm the inerrancy of Scripture. We have no statement about how to interpret that particular passage or the age of the earth. That is not part of our doctrinal statement. It does show up in the brief statement of the Missouri Synod, but that's not part of our history. So we don't have that. So there should be no issues on that subject. And yeah, even in our predecessor church bodies of the AALC, there were plenty of inerrantist theologians, very high view of Scripture, confessional people who were not convinced of a young earth biblically. So I don't think that kind of question should be a hindrance in any way. But I know that's an issue that everybody gets angry about. All right. Well, thank you so much for watching this. I went over the time I meant to, but thanks for sticking around, everybody. And I like to do these every once in a while. So if you have other questions, save them. We'll be doing this again. And hopefully I can get to your questions next time if I didn't get to them this time. All right. Well, everyone have a great day, and we'll see you in the next one. God bless.